Okay, welcome. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to this program titled Dignity, Law, and Transgender Lives. My name is Steve Sanders. I teach here at the law school. Let me begin by thanking the people who made this program possible. This is one in a series of programs being sponsored this year by IU's Institute for Advanced Study under the general topic of dignity, equality, and social justice. And so the funding for our speakers and to help make the program possible comes in large part from the Institute for Advanced Study and their program called the REMAC Seminar, which is named after a legendary IU professor and administrator, Henry Remak. As part of this, there's also an exhibition for the next month at the Lilly Library. And it's an exhibition that takes advantage of really unique materials in the Lilly Rare Book collection, devoted to kind of exploring different senses of the meaning dignity. And so we've put together, there's one display case that has some documents related to the post-World War II human rights movement. There's a draft of what would become the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's a copy of the post-war German Constitution, which was the first constitution to explicitly protect human dignity as a constitutional right. There is a case devoted to the Emancipation. The Lilly Library has a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, a copy of an early draft of the 13th Amendment as it was going through Congress, some deeds of emancipation given by their owners to slaves. There's a case devoted to things in the Lilly collection, some interesting documents related to the history of the women's movement and the LGBT rights movement. So if you have a chance, the Lilly Library is a real treasure. It's in the Lincoln Room, appropriately enough, of the Lilly Library. That exhibition is part of this year-long dignity programming, and that's up until March 15th. Other people who've made this program possible, the Maurer School of Law and many staff people in the law school who helped with this, the Department of Gender Studies, the Kinsey Institute, the Law School Center for Law, Society, and Culture, Outlaw, our student LGBT group here in the law school, the IU GLBT Alumni Association, the Maurer LGBT Alumni Advisory Board, and Bloomington Pride. And as I mentioned, Bloomington Bagel Company donated the cookies in the back. We have some cookies and coffee if you'd like those now or later. I'll say a few introductory remarks, but let me first introduce our speakers who are here with us today as part of the program. Joshua Block, who's there on TV. Josh had a family issue come up, but we were able to figure out a way, even though he couldn't travel, to get him here, the next best thing to having him here in person. Josh Block is a senior staff attorney with the National ACLU's LGBT and HIV projects. He is the lead counsel in the first Federal Court of Appeals decision recognizing that Title VII, the federal law against sex discrimination in education, protects the rights of transgender students to use restrooms consistent with their gender identity. That case goes to the Supreme Court and will be argued by Josh on March 28th. Is that the right date, Josh?
That's right.
All right. If you watched the Grammys last weekend, Laverne Cox said, go Google Gavin Grimm. Today you'll be hearing from Gavin Grimm's lawyer at the Supreme Court. Josh previously worked on Supreme Court marriage equality cases, the Obergefell decision, Windsor, and litigated cases seeking marriage equality for same-sex couples in a number of states. His current docket also includes cases involving employment discrimination, the use of religion to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, access to health care for transgender people, military service, censorship, free speech. Josh holds his law degree from Yale in 2012. He was named one of the best LGBT lawyers under 40 by the LGBT Bar Association. And Jody Herman, here with me, is a scholar of public policy at the Williams Institute, a think tank devoted to sexual orientation and gender identity issues at UCLA Law School. Jody holds her PhD in public policy and public administration from George Washington University, where her doctoral dissertation focused on the development of anti-discrimination protections in public facilities for transgender and gender nonconforming people. Jody served as co-author of a groundbreaking report, Injustice at Every Turn, based on on the National Transgender Discrimination Survey conducted by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force and the National Center for Transgender Equality. At the Williams Institute, her work has focused on research on the fiscal and economic impact of marriage for same-sex couples, the fiscal impact of employment discrimination against transgender persons, the development of trans-inclusive questions for population-based surveys. Her main research interests are the impact of gender identity-based discrimination and issues related to gender regulation in public spaces and the built environment. I was at a presentation last spring it's called the Indiana Judicial College. It's a sort of CLE for judges all over the state, and they invite other judges as well as academics to come in and talk about issues to judges. And there was a presentation there about the emerging issue in Indiana of what standards should be expected if a person wants a legal change of gender, to have the gender marker changed on their birth certificate or their driver's license. And I was struck that the judge, a person who is a state judge in Marion County, sort of introduced this topic, and I can't quote her exactly, but it was sort of, we all have things in our professional lives that we're called on to do that we may have difficulty with or we may find to be unpleasant. And this is sort of just one of those things you have to learn to deal with. And it seemed to me an unfortunate way to begin a presentation that was supposed to be educating judges about part of their job and about people that they would be serving. I'm on Twitter, sort of on and off, and if you follow, Twitter, there's a lot of active discussion about transgender issues, and this caught my eye. Just something I found. Sean Davis is the co-founder of something called The Federalist, which is a conservative website, but I mean, it's mainstream conservative. Responsible people write for them, and he's had other positions. He posted this at one point. This was just a month or so ago. He said, "Can't wait for the first lawsuit against a doctor who didn't do a prostate check on a woman who thinks she's a man." And if you follow certain conservative commentators, there's this consistent sort of tone of snark. When they're talking about Josh's client, Gavin Grimm, they'll talk about girls who think they're boys. This kind of insulting characterization. And so in light of the theme of the REMAX seminar, and especially in light of the Supreme Court's marriage decision, Obergefell, which talked 9 times about the concept of human dignity under the Constitution, it just really became clear to me, and one reason I wanted to do this program is I think so many of the legal and political questions and issues surrounding transgender individuals involve not just a sense of formal equality under the law, they also involve a basic expectation of dignity, that you will be treated with dignity by your fellow citizens and by your government. And so what does that involve? Those are some of the issues I hope we'll be talking about today. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask Jody and then Josh to each speak for 10 or 11 minutes. Jody has a presentation that I think will really helpfully lay a lot of groundwork about what we know today about the transgender population in the United States, as well as what legal protections exist and what legal protections don't exist. Then I'm going to turn it over to Josh and ask him to spend about 10 minutes or so telling you about his client, who is Gavin Grimm, and exactly what are the questions that the Supreme Court will be asked to adjudicate in this case that he'll be arguing a little over a month from now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jody.
Okay, great, thanks. So yes, again, my name's Jody Herman. I'm a scholar at the Williams Institute. Just out of curiosity, has anyone heard of the Williams Institute? Oh, great. Well, that's actually a lot more people than I thought. That's fantastic. So for those who don't know, we are a research center in the UCLA School of Law, and we focus on law and policy issues related to gender identity and sexual orientation. And we have a mission to produce research that's responsive to current policy debates. But one of the things that has been a roadblock on occasion to us doing our research is the lack of research and data collection about transgender people and even LGBT people generally. So a lot of the ways that we learn about the US population are through federal surveys, through like the census or the American Community Survey. We get our unemployment rate from the current population survey through BLS. But all of these systems are health indicators, National Health Interview Survey. But none of these surveys ask questions that would help us identify LGBT people. Gary Gates, one of my colleagues, figured out a way to do this through the census with same-sex couples. So we have to do a lot of work to either do our own data collection or do smaller scale studies to reach the populations that we're trying to reach through our research. So today I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we know about the transgender population from available data sources, a little bit about people's experiences that might be more relevant to a discussion about the Gavin Grimm case, and to talk a little bit about the law and policy landscape right now. And I'm going to try to do all of that in 10 minutes. We'll see if I succeed. Okay. All right, great. So first off, I wanted to talk about a study that we did using data from the CDC's Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance System. The CDC in 2014 offered an optional module that states who are administering this survey could adapt, which asked questions about sexual orientation and gender identity. So luckily, I work with a stats whiz who was able to take that data from 19 states and do a model to predict proportions of the trans population in states that we had no data for. So for the first time, we were able to create estimates about the size or the proportion of states where for adults who identify as transgender. And so we found overall that about 0.6% of adults in the U.S. Identify as transgender, which is about 1.4 million adults. And then we did another model to predict one age group younger than was available to us. So we looked at 13 to 17-year-olds and found that about 0.7% of youth in that age range would identify as transgender, and that's about 150,000 youth. So this map is just, the color gradient is off. It is not so great, but lighter colored states have a lower proportion of adults who identify as transgender, and darker states have a higher proportion. So Georgia was a bit of a surprise, frankly. Oh, that's a little bit better. And then we were also able to look more at age distribution. So we were able to, like I said, project that younger age group. But it seems like in this study, which is using actual representative data, which is fairly rare, that youth are more likely to identify as transgender than adults. Now, anecdotally, this is something that people have thought, but the more data that we get, that's kind of confirming that anecdotal evidence. In particular, in this data set, we found that people who identify as transgender and gender nonconforming, and you could identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, transgender man, or transgender woman, that people who identify in the gender nonconforming category, their average age is much lower than people who identify as trans men or trans women. So suggesting that people who identify in ways that are non-binary might overall just be younger. And so, again, that's what people have thought anecdotally, but we have more evidence now that that's actually true. Another finding that seems to be somewhat consistent, it was not, we didn't find this when we looked just in California, but that adults who identify as transgender are more likely to be people of color, and more like that population is a little bit more racially and ethnically diverse than the U.S. general population. We can't assert yet why this is the case. We need to do more research, but it seems this finding keeps popping up in what population-based data that we have, that trans folks are more racially and ethnically diverse. So that's basically what we know about the trans population based on the CDC survey. We're doing more modeling to look at other aspects, but the other way that people have studied trans people's experience in the U.S. is just to seek out trans people and ask them to take a survey. And I was part of the team that did Injustice at Every Turn, which was based on the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. In 2015, we did a follow-up called the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey. Anyone ever hear of this when it was happening? Oh, cool. Anyway, so we wanted to double the size of the prior survey, which had about 6,500 respondents. So we were hoping for about 12,000 respondents. We got 28,000 respondents. That's a heck of a lot of data to clean for the nerds in the room. But 1/3 were who took the survey identified as non-binary or genderqueer in some way, which is much larger than the prior survey. So just a couple things. Respondents came from all 50 states, D.C., and territories, including Guam, and it covered a lot of topics, pretty much all aspects of life, but I'm just going to talk about a couple here. But one thing I did want to show you quickly is that the map on the left, each little dot represents a respondent to the U.S. Trans Survey. And on the right is the population distribution of the United States. It's a little faded, unfortunately. But the point is that our respondents to the 2015 survey came from basically everywhere that people live in the United States. So trans folks don't just live in San Francisco or New York, right? So trans people live everywhere. The other point I like to make about this is no legislator should think that they don't have trans people among their constituents, right? So they should keep that in mind. So I just want to talk about experiences in school and restrooms that were found in the survey. So we asked people to reflect on their experiences in K-12 and in higher education. And over half said that and this was just out of people who said that they were either out as trans while they were in school or they were perceived by others to be trans while they were in school. So over half said that they had been verbally harassed. Nearly a quarter said that they had been physically attacked. 13% said they had been sexually assaulted in some way, and 17% said that they had to leave school because their mistreatment was so bad. So these should be startling numbers for folks. And of course, this was retrospective. I don't have just the data from the youngest age group who might have fresher recollections of what happened in school. But still, these are quite alarming statistics. And the last piece I'll show from this survey really is just about bathrooms generally. Believe it or not, I did my doctoral dissertation about bathrooms. I got some strange looks at the time, but now people are emailing me saying, oh gosh, that was kind of relevant, wasn't it? Anyway, so we recreated some questions from my doctoral dissertation study for this survey and found that just in the past year, 9% have been denied access to a restroom, 12% were verbally harassed, physically attacked, or sexually assaulted. About 59, well over half, avoided public restrooms for fear of confrontation or having some sort of problem using them. About 32% limited the amount that they ate or drank to avoid restrooms. So if you were planning to be out all day, you just don't drink any water during the day, so you don't need to use the restroom. And then 8% reported having some sort of physical problem because of avoiding bathrooms. So this is also a public health concern. And I tried to make that point in my dissertation as well, that if you're in a school situation, and you're either made to use a specific bathroom. I remember I interviewed a young trans man who was made to use a bathroom in the counselor's office, which was way far away from his classes. He had to decide, okay, am I just going to hold it through the next class, or am I going to go and then be late to my next class and get what do they call it? We used to call them tardy slips. I don't know what they call them anymore. But so those are the decisions that he had to make, and he would talk about how he would, if he chose to hold it, he would not be able to focus, right? How do you focus on your studies when you can't even take care of basic human needs? So that's something to think about, that these are somewhat common problems. And just briefly, I wanted to talk about the lay of the land for federal and state. And I have to admit, I made these slides before the November election, and so the first couple slides there might be some things that change coming up. But for the federal landscape, there have been a series, there has been progress in a lot of ways in protecting trans people from discrimination. There was consensus among some federal agencies at one point in time, maybe not now, that sex discrimination, that transgender people are covered under unlawful sex discrimination protections, and that would apply to Title VII, Title IX, the DOE guidance I won't get into, maybe Josh will, but there were also regulations about access to HUD-funded shelters. The Affordable Care Act, which may or may not be around much longer, has a non-discrimination section that's been interpreted to cover trans people. There's the Federal Hate Crimes Act. The State Department did new rules about how people can update their passports, and Social Security records administration, the Social Security Administration did new rules too, and military service. Now we have trans people allowed to serve openly in the military. On the state landscape, it's very much so a patchwork. States have a lot of different rules for, say, identity documents or restroom access, school policies, non-discrimination statutes, and I'll just show a few maps. And notice where Indiana is on all these maps, by the way. Spoiler alert, it's not good from my perspective. So here we have 20 states, plus the District of Columbia, who have employment non-discrimination statutes. Wisconsin and New Hampshire are a little odd because they cover sexual orientation only. And then here's the map for public accommodations non-discrimination statutes. I think it's pretty much the same, except for I think Utah drops off there. So that's 19 states plus the District of Columbia. Oh, there's an alarm. State has law preventing passage or enforcement of a local non-discrimination law. So that would be like HB2 in North Carolina. Have people heard of HB2? Yeah, okay. So that's that there. And then just the final slide here, just thinking about schools now. Schools non-discrimination statutes, the map here is a little bit different. But we've still got 13 states plus DC who have a law that prohibits discrimination in schools on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So there's a huge swath of the country that has not shown up on any of these, where there is room to improve non-discrimination laws for trans people. And I think I'll leave that there. I think I probably went way over time. But I don't know if we want to leave this up, but if you're interested in more information, you can check out our website or send us an email. Hand that back over to you.
So, Josh, I think you can hear us if we can hear him. Sorry, Josh, you weren't able to see the slides. Virginia is not one of those states that protects against school discrimination. Your client, Gavin Grimm, is in Virginia. He sued his school district. So tell us who Gavin Grimm is and a sense of what the issues are that you're in the middle of briefing right now in the U.S. Supreme Court.
I was muted for a second, sorry. So, Gavin is now a 17-year-old high school senior. When all of this began, he was a 15-year-old sophomore, actually just beginning his sophomore year of high school. Gavin's a transgender boy who attends school in Gloucester County, Virginia, which is a fairly rural county that is near the Virginia shore. And at the end of his freshman year, actually Gavin's gender dysphoria had become so great from lack of treatment that he was actually unable to attend class for a period of time. Over the summer, he finally was able to get the treatment and support he needed, transitioned over the summer, had his name legally changed, completely socially transitioned to living consistently with his gender identity. And everything was fine when he came back to school. He had supportive administrators, the principal, the guidance counselor, who all recognized him based on his gender identity. And when he asked to use the same restrooms as other boys, they allowed him to do so. The problem started when some adults complained to the school board because they had heard about the girl using the boys' room. We actually don't know what the adults said because the school board's never actually disclosed what complaints it got or why or where they came from. But in response to those complaints, the school board passed a new policy that actually overruled its own administrators and said that from now on, students will be limited to using the restrooms based on their biological gender, and whatever biological gender means. I don't think I've ever seen that particular phrase anywhere. And students with gender identity issues, in the words of the school board, will be provided an alternative appropriate private facility. So Gavin, as a result, the only real restrooms open to him were either the nurse's office, like at one far end of the school, or some single user restrooms the school created specifically for him after it passed this policy. It converted some old utility closets into single stall restrooms, and it said everyone can use those restrooms, but everyone knows they were created for Gavin in order to remove him from the same restrooms other boys used. One of the people at the school board meetings had said, put him in a single user restroom if that's what it's going to take. And they were designed to put him in that restroom so he wouldn't be with other people. Now, Title IX is a federal statute that prohibits sex discrimination in educational institutions receiving federal funds, and which includes virtually every public school in the country. And it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. So it's been pretty well established for 15, 20 years that discriminating against someone because they're transgender is a form of discrimination on the basis of sex. But it's only in the past couple of years that courts and agencies have begun to further clarify that when someone's excluded from using the same restrooms as someone else because they're transgender, that is discrimination on the basis of sex. And, the transgender people are just trying to use the same restrooms as everyone else. The only way they can use those restrooms is if they're allowed to use the ones, that match their gender identity. And excluding a transgender boy like Gavin from the boys' restroom, discriminates against him and effectively, forces him into separate facilities that no one else has to use. This case was the first federal case to generate a Court of Appeals holding that endorses that view. What's the wrinkle in the case is Title IX has a regulation in it that says schools can provide separate restrooms schools may provide separate toilet facilities on the basis of sex, but such facilities must be comparable. And the school wants to say, those regulations say this is allowed. We're discriminating on the basis of sex, but the regulation says we can do that. That's what happens in bathrooms. And, the answer is the regulation doesn't say you can discriminate. It says you can provide restrooms. You have to provide them in a non-discriminatory manner. And you couldn't say, only feminine women can use this restroom and only masculine men can use this other restroom. They have to be equally available to everyone. And, we have single sex restrooms and programs across the country, and all of those programs already integrate trans people based on their gender identity. That's true of the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts, the Seven Sisters Colleges, the military, NCAA, all of them treat trans people consistently with their identity because that's the only way they can actually be included. So we lost in the district court, we won in the Court of Appeals, and the way the Court of Appeals issued its ruling, it said, we don't have to decide on our own what interpretation of the regulation we think is right because the Department of Education has explained that they don't interpret the regulation to authorize this discriminatory policy, and it's enough for us to defer to the Department of Education's interpretation. I think that, unfortunately, that put the decision in the crosshairs of people who worry about federal overreach and, the active Obama administration, and I think that it gave the school board and its allies an opening to try to characterize this as a who decides question. That was how Judge Sutton, the Sixth Circuit judge who issued Obergefell, but the marriage case that the Supreme Court overturned, he said this is a question about who decides, courts or legislatures, and it's allowed some people to paint this as a question of who decides, the federal government or the states. And I think largely based on that sort of pitch, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, and it agrees to hear two questions. The first is whether or not the Department of Education's interpretation should get deference. The second was, what's the right interpretation? And we don't know yet what's going to happen to the Department of Education's interpretation. It hasn't officially been rescinded yet. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. We're not quite sure. But if it is rescinded, that first question of, do you defer to the department goes away. But that second question of what does the statute and regulation mean still remains. And we're going to find out pretty soon what the Supreme Court wants to do.
So, Josh, you've raised an issue. So this is one of many issues where the change of administration in Washington matters, right? So much of the argument you're relying on is a legal position that the Obama administration took that many people believe the Trump administration will not take, and that has a direct bearing on at least one of the issues in your case, right?
Yeah, that's right. You can't overstate, the importance of what's happened over the past 8 years with every single agency in the federal government, recognizing that trans men are men, trans women are women, and integrating them, consistently with their gender identity. Now, that's really important because it allows the federal government to proactively protect people, according to what the law requires, and it's important because of this deference issue. But it's still important to underscore that, those interpretations are right because they're right. That's what the statute requires. How we argue it all along is, this is what Title IX and the regulations mean. And if you had any questions about it, defer to the agency. But it's never been the idea that the agencies are who have been creating these protections. The protections already exist by virtue of Title IX, and if the agencies are no longer going to be interpreting it the right way, then we just got to go to court ourselves and get the courts to set them straight.
So when you talk to people about this case, do people automatically tend to assume this must be some big cosmic constitutional issue, that the sort of the future of transgender rights may hinge on this decision? Not at all to underestimate the stakes in this case, the great work you guys are doing, but how much will the outcome of this case, you think, shape the discourse around transgender rights more generally? During the gay marriage litigation, a process of 20 years, there was a huge amount. There was litigation, there was legislation, there were conversations, and that probably helped change public opinion. What do you think will be the impact of this case, if you win or if you lose, on the broader dialogue about transgender rights and equality?
Well, so there's a claim under Title IX, and there's also a constitutional claim that the lower court hasn't ruled on yet. So even if you lose the Title IX claim, the constitutional claim is still there. So a court could issue a narrow ruling saying, hey, we have a regulation that we interpret to authorize this. We don't have to decide whether that regulation, is, right or wrong or constitutional or not. That'll be a separate claim. So I don't think that, a loss is final in that way. That said, if a court were really hostile, it could write a very broad opinion saying, this idea that trans people are protected under sex discrimination statutes is, baloney, and, sex discrimination statutes only protect, people for having particular chromosomes, and that's it. And that would have some pretty bad, rippling effects.
At that point, you'd go beyond the school context, because Title VII, the federal employment non-discrimination law, has been interpreted by some courts to include gender identity discrimination is a form of sex discrimination. You're saying there's the possibility the Supreme Court could undercut that.
Yeah, I think if it went out of its way, it could do that and have like much broader side effects. I don't think that's what would happen. I don't think we're going to get the Bowers versus Hardwick of transgender protections, mainly because, I think, as in so many cases, the critical vote here is Justice Kennedy. And I think that even if he rules against us, at least my hope is that he wouldn't intentionally write something that would have all those broader negative effects for it. Now, even if it's a narrow opinion, though, I don't think that this issue of what restroom you're going to be able to use or whether you're going to be able to use the restroom at all is a minor thing. It's really central to the ability of trans people to exist in society and in public spaces. You can't use the restroom, you can't go anywhere. And I hope that the justices have watched Hidden Figures over the winter break because I think it really powerfully illustrates how this isn't just about proving a point. And dignity is really important, but it's not just about dignity. It's really about the ability to function as a full member of a community wherever you are. And there's also powerful stories by Justice Ginsburg and other people of being some of the first women to enter Harvard Law School, and you had to make a mad dash across campus to go to the only women's restroom. And Justice O'Connor herself talks about how when I first came to the Supreme Court, there wasn't a restroom anywhere near the court that I could use. And I'm hoping that those types of examples really, drive home what's happening here and the significance of these sorts of restrictions.
Let me ask you, so Jody, when you and I were talking, you said that sort of bathroom panic has been a civil rights issue beyond just transgender rights, that the politics of bathrooms has been a sort of theme of civil rights.
Yeah, it keeps coming up, doesn't it? Just talking about Justice Ginsburg at Harvard, there was, I think it was 1992 or sometime in the early 90s that was considered the quote-unquote year of the woman in the Senate, because we had elected like a handful of female senators. It's funny, year of the woman, there's 3 of us or however many. But the female senators at that time had no restrooms that were available for them to use. In fact, I think it was Barbara Mikulski or somebody that was just in some sort of news article or retrospective was talking about this issue more recently. But women senators had to go use the tourist bathrooms. And so they would be out there mingling with the tourists while their male colleagues had their own private facilities.
Like civil rights movement, right? I mean,
yeah,
separate facilities and so forth.
Think about segregation and Jim Crow.
So beyond schools, so there's HB2 in North Carolina. Talk about is there another wave of this bathroom legislation from states hitting us or about to hit us?
Yeah, well, I think in my public policy brain, I think about it as state policy innovation. So when a state kind of steps out first and does something, other states kind of, their ears perk up and they're like, oh, well, maybe we should try that too. But, bathrooms have been part of the civil rights discourse for a very long time. And most recently, this bathroom panic, quote unquote, has been utilized in order to undermine efforts to put anti-discrimination protections in place, or also just repeal existing protections. So I don't know if folks are familiar with what happened in Houston recently with quote unquote, I think it's called a HERO, the Human Rights Ordinance there. But they got a ballot initiative, and the folks who wanted to repeal the Human Rights Ordinance had a very just simple slogan. It was like, no men in women's bathrooms. And they whittled the whole issue down to that one tagline, and they won. Bathroom panic has been happening. But I actually just quickly looked and to see how many states have bathroom bills pending right now, and it's actually substantially more than I thought.
Say, you must use a bathroom that is consistent with your biological sex.
Right. It's definitely targeted towards trans people.
Yeah, make that a law.
Yeah. So it's about sex assigned at birth or birth certificate. There's a birth certificate language.
The reason I say purport is, it's kind of commonly acknowledged these really can't be enforced, right? These are symbolic, expressive statements. I think statements of anti-dignity that are being directed at trans people by these states. Is that?
Yeah. Well, there's one state in particular, I forget which, maybe Josh knows, that they're saying that if you have a situation where people can go to the restroom according to their gender identity, like if you don't have a statute in place that limits based on sex assigned at birth, that there have to be bathroom attendants placed in public restrooms. So we're going to have bathroom police, apparently, checking everybody as they're coming in and out. Yeah. I forget which state that is, but it was on the list that I looked at. So we have Alabama and Illinois, Kansas, Kentucky, Minnesota, Missouri, New Jersey, strange enough. New York, also surprising. Oklahoma has something specific about the Department of Education guidance, I think trying to undermine enforcement of that. South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Washington.
So these are all places where there's legislation pending.
Yeah, either the bills have been introduced or they're sitting in committee right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Josh, after North Carolina enacted its law that did that, they sued the United States government, and the United States sued North Carolina. So, stepping away from Gavin's case for a second, what is going on in the federal courts right now? This issue is before a federal court, whether North Carolina is violating the Equal Protection Clause, maybe other provisions of the Constitution, by purporting to tell transgender people in public buildings, you can't use the bathroom that's consistent with your gender identity, you must use it according to your chromosomal sex. Just briefly, what's the status of the federal litigation on whether North Carolina can do that or whether these kinds of laws violate the Constitution?
Yeah, so, North Carolina is luckily in the Fourth Circuit, which is the same circuit that ruled on Gavin's case. And so there are two different components to the North Carolina law. One is how this affects educational facilities, and the other is how it affects public buildings outside of that context. For purposes of educational facilities, the case is controlled by Gavin's case, and based on that, the district court issued a preliminary injunction prohibiting enforcement of the statute, at UNC. Now, for public buildings, governmental buildings outside that context, you need the Equal Protection Clause because Title IX doesn't reach that. And the district court issued the PI on the Title IX claim, but denied a preliminary injunction on the Equal Protection claim. We've appealed that, and that has been briefed at the Fourth Circuit. An oral argument in that case is going to be scheduled for May sometime. I think a lot of stuff on related cases and issues has been sort of put on hold for a little while in many courts until everyone sees what the Supreme Court's going to do.
Okay, all right. Jody, what other issues, maybe non-obvious issues, are affecting now sort of the ability of transgender people to have legal dignity and social equality? Access to health care and medical care is an issue that you have studied.
Yeah, that's access to health care. First off, the ACA anti-discrimination provision that I mentioned, we're not necessarily sure what's going to happen with that. We've been told that it's going to be repealed and replaced, but I think everyone's still waiting for that to happen. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with that provision. I don't know if Josh has any intel in that regard on the ACA. But also, transition-related healthcare is something that has been routinely excluded from health insurance plans. And I think those exclusions started popping up back in the 80s. And so it's only been recently where there has been a lot of momentum to get transition-related healthcare exclusions removed from health insurance plans. There are several states now that I don't remember how many off the top of my head, maybe 13, whose regulatory agencies have said that health insurance plans that are sold in their state can't exclude transition-related healthcare. And there's a growing number of employers that are providing it. The Human Rights Campaign tracks that over time. They actually, has anyone heard of the Corporate Equality Index, where the Human Rights Campaign rates employers by how LGBT friendly they are? Okay. So in 2011, I think they started requiring employers that wanted to be rated to provide transition-related health care in order to maintain their 100% HRC rating. And I think people underestimated how many employers think that that's like, you have to have a 100% rating, that it's very coveted, because the number of employers, I think they just cover AmLaw 100 and Fortune 1000 employers, the number of employers providing that shot up rather dramatically once it was required for their 100% score. But, when it's not covered by health insurance, it's something that has to be covered out of pocket. More states are adding, removing exclusions from their Medicaid coverage, which is good. But even though the situation is improving, it's still a challenge to access transition-related health.
And let me ask both Josh and Jody about this. So, access to changes of key identity documents. And I'm curious to know, in your experience, from what you hear from clients, from people who come to the ACLU, Jody, from your research, what is the state of that? I mean, so in Indiana right now, if you are transitioning gender, it's fairly straightforward to get a change of name. It's a little more hard, it's a little dicier and a little more questionable about getting a legal change of gender. There's a lot of forum shopping that goes on. It's one of those things that it's known that in some counties, judges have a fairly lenient attitude, that if you get essentially a letter from your doctor that says, my client is undergoing clinically appropriate treatment, and the court will issue an order saying that your official gender marker and your birth certificate and your driver's license should be changed. Other judges in other counties want to see evidence of surgery and hormone treatments. This is something the legislature hasn't fixed yet. And so I'm just wondering, nationally, what are the big challenges? Do there remain significant challenges to just get basic government documents changed to reflect a person's gender identity? This is a real struggle, I know, on a day-to-day basis for people in Indiana.
Josh, did you have anything on that?
Well, I think it varies state by state, which is part of, the problem. Some states are really good at issuing government documents that, match your gender identity, whether it's driver's licenses or birth certificates. Other states are pretty onerous. There are at least 2 states, there might be a third, where it's impossible to get your birth certificate changed. Some other states require genital surgery. Some other states require some form of surgery. And some states require some form of medical treatment. And then there are some states that don't require any. But luckily, silver lining, driver's license policies are usually more lenient, in part because it's incredibly dangerous to have a driver's license that doesn't match your gender identity. I think every time you're sort of pulled over by a police officer, sorry, I have a phone ringing, you're effectively exposing yourself to the officer as someone who's transgender. Anytime you go, give your ID to get into a club, give your ID to the bouncer, you're sort of constantly at risk of being outed. And whether or not someone is out, it doesn't mean that they want their status as someone who's trans revealed involuntarily. We've had success in 2 cases challenging state laws with respect to driver's licenses that didn't issue driver's licenses consistent with gender identity. Birth certificates is harder. In Gavin's case, because he had top surgery, he was able to get an amended birth certificate from Virginia early this year. Now, in a state that required genital surgery, that makes it impossible for any minor in most states to get an amended birth certificate, because under standards of care from the Standards of Care Organization, genital surgery is usually not available for people under 18. But the irony of this is, even though Gavin now has an amended birth certificate, the school is still prohibiting him from using the boys' bathroom. So if he went to North Carolina, where their law defines biological sex as the sex according to your birth certificate, he would be able to use the bathroom. But Gloucester County School District says he can't. And I think that there really was no right answer for Gloucester County when presented with the reality that he had an amended birth certificate. Either they could do what they're doing, which is saying, we don't care what the Commonwealth of Virginia says your sex is, we're going to define it for you, which is ridiculous. Or they could have said, okay, now you have an amended birth certificate, you can use the restroom. And that just demonstrates that this was never about any physiological difference all along. And his body hasn't changed any differently. I think it all just sort of goes to show that Gavin is in this situation because the school knows he's transgender. If the school did not know he was transgender, none of this would be happening. He'd be using the boys' restroom at school just like he uses everywhere else. The reason why the school is excluding him is because it thinks that other students' knowledge that he is transgender will make them uncomfortable or violate their privacy. It's not about a real physical difference. So I think that the birth certificate very much illustrates that fundamental point. The school wants to say this is about physiology and biology. It's really about social mores and fears of people who might be different than us.
Yeah, well, I wanted to follow up just on that question, and it's a related topic, but the one thing that I used to work at a voting rights group back in the day when I was going through grad school. And I started learning about voter identification laws. And so at the Williams Institute, I tried to do an analysis to estimate how many trans people might be negatively impacted by voter ID laws. So voter ID laws can range from, not every state has them. I think about 30 some states have some form of identification requirement in order to vote. Some you can bring in a utility bill, some that you can bring in your voter registration card or whatnot. But in the strictest states, which includes Indiana, you have to provide government-issued photo identification in order to vote. And then there are different rules about whether or not you can vote by mail or vote absentee in the states. So I tried to estimate how many trans people lived in the strictest voter ID states that required government-issued photo ID in order to vote, because if you're forced to go to the polls with incorrect ID, they might say, well, your ID doesn't match the voter registration rules, so therefore you can vote a provisional ballot, and you've got 5 days to come back with a correct ID, and then we'll let you vote. Then your vote will count. So a substantial proportion of trans folks do not have ID that actually, government-issued photo ID that actually matches their current presentation and gender identity. In the NTDS, out of people who might be eligible to vote, it was close to 30%. So I think that translated to maybe a couple, between 500 and 1,000 trans folks here in Indiana who potentially might not be able to vote because of their ID situation. So there's, IDs aren't just, for to hand over to the cop if you get a ticket or to get into a club. It can actually impact your ability to vote, which is, supposed to be a fundamental right.
Josh, I know we're going to lose you in a little bit, but let me ask you another question. So let's imagine that one of the justices asks you something like the following. What are the limits of the position that you're advocating for? Are there legitimate privacy and dignitary interests that sort of other students, other members of a school community have? What if it's not a bathroom where there are stalls and things are generally, there's a certain amount of privacy? What if it's a locker room? What if it's a changing facility? What if it's something, what if it's a transgender girl? What if it's someone who still has male genitalia seeking to use a women's locker room? Surely that kind of question is going to be on their minds. What's the answer to that? Are there legitimate questions that don't necessarily arise from bigotry that might be part of the concerns that parents and school board members have about how to navigate these questions?
So there are several answers to that. The first is that privacy of all students can be accommodated in a non-discriminatory manner. In Gloucester High School, they installed urinal dividers, from floor to ceiling, and put privacy strips around restroom stalls. There's a zero risk of exposure to nudity in the bathroom. So even if you thought that there were interests related to nudity that were different, none of that applies to Gavin or to Gavin's use of the restroom. In the locker room, too, I think that there's this idea among people, and maybe it's a generational thing, that everyone in a middle school locker room is walking around naked. And that's the last thing that middle schoolers want to do, much less a transgender middle school student. And so the reality is that a lot of the nudity stuff doesn't match what people's real experiences are. But at the end of the day, if schools are concerned about possible exposure to nudity, the answer can't be to simply banish trans people from public spaces. You have to do it in an equal and non-discriminatory manner. Many have private shower and restroom facilities. You can't have this sort of sweeping exclusion that doesn't even have any rational connection to what you're claiming to protect against. And this sort of idea of, what if people saw body parts of someone else, if it was a transgender girl? The solution isn't to put the transgender girl in the boys' restroom. She's going to have, breasts. From all appearances, she will be looking like any other girl in the boys' locker room. And I think one of the things that, we need to do in this case is sort of dispel some of these myths about what the physiology of trans people's bodies look like. This doesn't describe the experience of everyone, but you have kids that have been on hormone blockers and cross-sex hormone therapy, for years, and they will be going through puberty in a manner consistent with their gender identity. Their physiology, their including even their genitalia, actually looks different than for people who have been exposed to high levels of testosterone. And so I think that there's this assumption that by a lot of the people who pass these policies, that they know what who a transgender person is, and they don't. And I think getting people to step back and say, oh, wait a minute, this is actually more complicated than I thought it was, I think is really important in order to disrupt some of these assumptions.
Can you stick around for 5 more minutes? Are you okay?
You gotta
go. You have a family mission. Okay.
Preschool is really rough. They kick the kid out on the street if you're not there right on time.
All right. Should we let you go then?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you so much for having me.
Stay here. We'll talk to Jody. Thank you, Josh. All right. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
I want to ask Jody, sort of what is something we were talking about at lunch. What does science tell us about this phenomenon? What are some of the challenges of working in this area about documenting the phenomenon of gender identity for people who are resistant to the idea, for people who assume that there is a gender binary and law has to reflect that?
Well, yeah, I mean it's a difficult question, and it's actually a question that is being debated rather hotly politically about what are the origins of gender identity? Is gender identity something that's immutable? Is it a mutable characteristic? Same questions are asked about sexual orientation, and I think there was effort in sexual orientation to find the quote unquote gay gene, and that hasn't necessarily been fruitful. And there have been, the studies on brain structures between men and women to see if there's a male brain or a female brain. And I don't know that there's actually anything that they have found conclusively in that area of research yet, but I'm not really up on it. So that's a big question, and I think it's more so, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems like more so in a question in the legal realm because of the immutability criterion for, is it...
Pardon me.
You can school me a little bit on the immutability.
For heightened scrutiny?
For heightened scrutiny, right, yeah. Okay.
Well, I guess part of it gets to sort of this instinct I have that law wants to be able to, wants criteria for drawing lines to put people in boxes, that judges might be uncomfortable saying that, okay, you were biologically, chromosomally female. You're saying you were male. I need some evidence for how this could be possible.
Right.
I need to know this is something more than just a lightly considered thing. And part if it's going to have legal consequences, I want to know what the basis for believing that phenomenon is. And so that's where it seems to me there's a lot of opening for work to be done in this area.
Yeah, I think there is. It's certainly something that's not settled. And unfortunately, because, these are questions, about like the origins of gender identity, the origins of sexual orientation and whatnot, there's a somewhat now famous report that came out from the New Atlantis, the Meyer and McHugh report on sexual orientation and gender identity, where they did a lit review. They kind of tried to review the science, and their conclusion was that there's absolutely no scientific basis for the idea that
conservative, non-peer-reviewed journal.
Right, a conservative, non-peer-reviewed journal. One professor emeritus from Hopkins and another professor from Hopkins. And so, but their conclusions were that, basically there's no evidence that these are immutable characteristics. And then, of course, this report was utilized in the HB2 litigation, on behalf of North Carolina. And also, it's a favorite of Breitbart right now. They have been quoting that study quite a bit. But there are criticisms of that research in that it's incomplete. Like, for instance, they didn't really show if these are not immutable characteristics, regardless of the origins, then why aren't there successful conversions, right? So conversion therapy is something that has been studied a great deal, and there is consensus there that conversion, trying to change someone's sexual orientation or trying to change somebody's gender identity, is not only not successful, but it's potentially very harmful. And so a lot of states are now trying to outlaw conversion therapy, at least for licensing within the state for therapy with minors. So they didn't provide any evidence that you can, if it's not immutable, that anyone can change. So that science is it's still up for debate.
This was also a phenomenon in the sort of early gay marriage litigation, that there just wasn't a lot of research out there about what was the impact on children, for example, being raised in same-sex households. And it was easy then for opponents to say, to rely on studies involving very small sample sizes and so forth. But then eventually the research got better and was much more supportive.
Actually, that's one line of research that Williams Institute affiliated researchers have been involved with like Nanette Gartrell, Henny Boss, Abby Goldberg, who were thinking ahead, of course, for this, and did longitudinal studies of children of same-sex parents, particularly lesbian mothers. And so longitudinal matched pairs, so a control group and the same-sex couples. And when you're comparing apples to apples, similar family structures, two-parent families, whatnot, there really is no substantial or significant difference between them. But sometimes it's tough at Williams when some of these issues come up, where the answer really is to do some sort of long longitudinal study. And so I think they were pretty not prophetic's not the right word, but they were very intentional with establishing, in the early 2000s, a whole slew of research that would be longer term, but have the answers to dispel some of these myths. And
now the question becomes kind of, what do we need in that way related to gender identity,
exactly,
gender transition,
yeah, we need a whole research agenda.
So we've got some time. I want to open this up to folks who might have questions. One of my students, Jackson Ford, has very kindly agreed to wield. I'm going to call on my colleague Colin in the back, and then here in the front first. So Jackson, there, the guy in the blue jacket. We need the microphone just so this is being videotaped, so the recording can pick you up. Colin Johnson from Gender Studies, who's part of our REMAX seminar planning group.
So I just wanted to sort of ask a question about one of the statistics that you pointed out in your research had to do with kind of the shift in sort of amongst younger people to this, and this kind of goes to the question you were asking, to sort of non-binary identifications or gender non-conforming as an identification, as opposed to trans per se, or trans men or trans women, which could actually mean a number of things, right? I mean, it could mean that there's a shift in kind of nomenclature or the language that people are using to kind of describe and position themselves, or it could mean that a broader population of people are beginning to sort of see themselves as being implicated in one way or another in the destabilization of kind of these rigid notions of binary difference. But obviously, that trend, if it continues or expands, poses a kind of interesting challenge with regard to legal arguments for, sort of the protection of trans rights, precisely because a lot of the things that were being described there were assertions about kind of the utility of a kind of, a gender binary in terms of making rights claims and claims about discrimination. So I'm curious to know, what you think about that, but it raises a second question for me, which is the entire kind of approach that's taken often in terms of expanding trans rights claims, or really any rights claims, which is to kind of start from the position of, how do I phrase this? The individual, rather than questioning, for example, what legitimate interest the state has in knowing anything about your gender identification. Like, on what legal basis does the state, other than mere custom, have a right to insist on an identification that then puts you in a position to be a thwart with respect to a world that sort of is just kind of customarily divided along binaristic lines?
Well, that's a lot. There's a lot of there.
Or whatever.
Or whatever. Right. So I think that there has not been a lot of, at least in the research realm, trying to sort out what is driving trends that we see in gender identity, especially among youth. So, I mean, one of the reasons that's posited a lot is that there's a lot of more visibility now of trans. There's more visibility about trans identities now, and that there's also a growing level of acceptance. And so, does more education and more acceptance allow people over time to be more themselves than they previously would have been if they believed to be living in a system that was particularly rigid around gender roles. So I don't even know how to partially address what you brought up, but what I see in the data is a pretty clear trend. And the implications for policy are manifold. I mean, in my doctoral work, I posited, that we might have to figure out different ways to rearrange society that's not based on a gender binary. I mean, I think these questions around bathrooms are very indicative of the fact that we've established this type of binary gender system where all of our public spaces are kind of built around this idea. And so how do we, strangely enough, not everywhere. Traveling internationally, you see a lot of differences in the way that people, arrange their spaces. But, we have these spaces for, modesty and safety and security and whatnot. But maybe we need to rethink, the gender binary and gender segregation is the basis for providing, safety and security and modesty in public. Yeah, I mean, there's a law professor named Terry Kogan who actually did, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Terry Kogan's work, but it's really interesting. He actually he read like years and years worth of plumbing codes. And these plumbing codes dating back to, when we were kind of creating more public spaces and public buildings, and as women were entering more public commercial activities. Like some of the first places to have women's restrooms were department stores. But he looked at the plumbing codes, and based on his, research, he found that these plumbing codes were just kind of reinforcing the Victorian idea of separate spheres, where, men's places in public and women's places in the home. And so in order to allow women in public, they still have to be cordoned off somewhere. And so our reliance on the gender binary for our safety, security, and whatnot is just really kind of a reinforcement in physical structures of this Victorian separate spheres ideology. And so why did we do that? And why it's become like a reified concept in our society that this is just the way that we do things, but maybe we should consider better ways, new and improved ways. So. Yeah.
I'm a 65-year-old trans woman, but so I think you're talking about the 1% difference between the youth and adults, and I have a little bit different theory about that I talked to you about, but that isn't what I want to talk about. Josh, I wanted to say this to Josh, and because there's a lot of legal minds here, I want to bring up this point. I thought it was interesting, he pointed out that if Gavin went to North Carolina, because the law says that your birth certificate is the judge. Mm-hmm. Well, North Carolina, to get your birth certificate changed, you have to have bottom surgery.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And to get bottom surgery, at least for female to male, or male to female, you have to be sterilized. In Sweden, they, until about 2 or 3 years ago, to get your gender changed or get sex changed, you had to sign off on being sterilized. Right. And the European community said that was a human rights violation, and that's how it got changed there. So I think I want somebody to get the information, the ACLU, and I think that's an important issue, that I think that that whole issue there is, to me, is an important issue.
Can I say something about that? I actually asked Mara Kiesling about this once, who is the executive director of the National Center for Transgender Equality. Like, why this? Because in some of the European countries, people talk about forced sterilization, and that's the way that this is discussed. It's forced sterilization in order to get X, Y, or Z. But that rhetoric is not used in the United States. Like, we just don't talk about it in that way here. And so. Yeah, I can see some clear disadvantages of talking about it that way, but it's just something that they will say in Europe, but they won't say here. Yeah, she didn't know either, frankly.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like maybe the solution is moving towards a more gender-neutral approach in public spaces, but do you think that's really the best remedy to give dignity to people who identify as transgender or as non-binary?
Well, what I think is that it's an issue that states and schools and governments are going to have to grapple with whether they like it or not. And so whether or not it's the best way to provide dignity in spaces, I guess that's up for question. But we don't have to configure our spaces the way that they're configured now in order to get, we can configure it in a way that dignity and privacy is maximized for everybody, right? And that helps everyone. So maybe I misunderstand your question.
And
because I'm thinking of, there are schools and colleges who have made an effort to offer gender-neutral bathrooms, gender-neutral housing, gender-neutral locker rooms, so that people, I don't want to say don't have to deal with that issue, but don't necessarily have to come out or out themselves in any way. They can use whatever bathroom they identify with, but the gender-neutral option is there if they don't want to identify at all. Mm-hmm. And I just don't know if that's the best remedy, because it's still kind of addressing that there's an other in a way. Like it seems like it's maybe not the best solution for providing dignity to a person who says, I identify as a woman, I want to use the women's bathroom.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Right.
Some people don't necessarily, some people want to honor a kind of gender distinction. They just want to, it's possible for that to be changed. It's not, it is mutable.
That people actually want gendered spaces.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Like, there was a case in Minnesota before the Gavin Grimm case ever came up. This is a long time ago. But it's called Goins v. West Group. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. But an employer asked that Goins, she's a trans woman who was working there at West Group. I think they were a publishing company. But she wanted to use the women's restroom, and they said that she had to use a gender-neutral restroom. And so it went to the Minnesota Supreme Court, and they actually found that under their anti-discrimination laws, the employer could determine which restroom their employees, not just trans people, but any employee, could use. So I think she lost in that regard. But her assertion was that she's a woman, she wants to use the women's restroom. She doesn't care for this gender neutrality issue. And so for some people, that's, that might be the case, and creating more gender neutrality for everybody might not be a desirable result of all of it. So I think there's diversity of opinion on that. But imagine a scenario where everybody had access to single occupancy restrooms, and there were no men's or women's restrooms. I don't know if anyone would be like, well, I absolutely want a multi-stall women's restroom where I can hang out with other women. I don't know if that claim would come up in that type of a scenario, but, that's all hypothetical, of course.
Other questions? Over here. And while Jackson's getting, I guess to me this is just such a multifaceted issue. I mean, one great thing that Jody's slide showed at the beginning is, what the state is of anti-discrimination laws in states, and there are federal courts now that are accepting that Title VII covers gender identity. So part of dignity is like formal equality, being able to complain when you are discriminated against on the basis of your gender identity or your transgender status. And part of dignity is just not being actively insulted by your government, which is what I think so many of these bathroom laws are just designed to do.
Sure.
And part of it is, being able to obtain health care. Part of it is just the public understanding more about what it means to be transgender or gender neutral or gender queer or something like that. That's why, I think some of us, now that Josh isn't here, some of us worry a little bit about the Supreme Court case about, if Gavin does lose, is that going to be translated into this kind of major setback, or will it cause people to fight harder and cause new people to sort of come into a movement in favor of transgender equality and dignity? Is the culture of this country around those issues, will it take as long as it did for gays and lesbians to sort of change public attitudes as well as to achieve legal equality? I just think that's a really interesting part of this whole case. Question over here.
I guess following what Professor Sanders just said, I don't mean to throw a wrench in the very reasonable answer you just gave on the bathrooms question, but I think since we're at an overall policy institute, I wanted to generally ask, how long do you think it would be until we kind of have some significant progress in all walks of life for trans folks to be fully integrated? Because the second you said that, well, we could just have single occupancy restrooms, I kind of thought of, well, there are some times when the government, for example, imprisons people, and that system is so completely segregated on a gender basis that it doesn't seem possible that we would just have such a simple solution to that. And I've worked a little bit in a trans-focused legal situation, and it feels like as soon as you start to make progress on one part of trans folks' trouble having a normal life, some other part of their life becomes difficult. So if you start working on employment stuff, you then have to work on identification stuff. And once you get to that point, you have to work on some healthcare stuff. And as an institute that focuses on trans people in all areas, how long do you think it will be until we're in a position where we don't just have a new problem every time trans people get one step forward?
Jody and I talked about this, and she hated the idea of my big sort of cosmic
I'm
questions.
sorry, that's a tough question.
It's going to be exactly 10 years and 12 months, like 13 days, and no, it's a very good question. And I think one thing that's hopeful is that there's work going on in all of those areas concurrently. So I don't think that there's like one specific issue that's getting all the attention and there's no attention being paid to other issues. I think there are emerging issues that probably are getting less attention than others. But, so we've seen, it's actually been startling to me from the time that I started working at the Williams Institute in 2010, how much progress has been made on some issues. The health insurance coverage issue in particular has really gained a lot of steam and has, states now, state regulatory agencies making determinations that you can't exclude transition-related health care. But then, of course, there are people who don't have access to insurance. So what do those folks do? And they've been working on Medicaid and whatnot. But I think that there was this, frankly, I don't want to, oh gosh, I was almost said like smugness, that's turned into such a dirty word lately. But there was a lot of confidence, I guess you'd say, among people who are working on specific issues that this was all happening much faster than anyone ever suspected. That trans equality under the law was something that we would see very soon, especially when there was the idea of a federal statute, that at least in terms of discrimination, we would have a statute. And people were very, very optimistic. And I have to say, a lot of that optimism and a lot of that confidence has come to a screeching halt as of late, to the point where folks like who are in the policy realm are trying to point out that there are a lot of small victories that are happening, even at the federal level, that there's still movement, that there's still momentum, particularly on identity docs and a lot of state-level work. So there's room for optimism, I guess, in that way. The work is not going to come to a screeching halt. But so I guess I'd be curious to hear more from you where you think the attention is not being paid and where you think that more work needs to be done. Because I see there's people that have their hands in all of the various places, I guess you'd say.
I think it was that I worked for a low-income attorney who does a lot of name and gender marker changes, Medicaid work, and some employment stuff. And it just seemed like every time a client solved one problem, they were like, great, now let me address the 5 other major health problems or, low-income problems or employment problems that just sort of come along with being a trans person. And it doesn't seem like those problems are going to move forward without just a general push in all of those areas. And I'm sure that, 30 years ago, this was how the gay community felt generally. It was that I have the general problems that are specific to being gay, but I also run into like 4 other problems because it makes me poor and it makes me unhealthy. And maybe that I should just be saying, well, maybe in 30 years it'll be like the 80s for the gay community. And maybe that's right, but I suppose I was going to just see if you had any thoughts on how you thought this was progressing and whether you thought it would be moving faster or slower.
I think
since the last
Amy
months were so hard.
I don't know. On this too, so.
I guess, well, my name's Amy Applegate, and I teach here at the law school. I wanted to say, partly in response to you, but first, thank you for this this presentation. It's been fantastic. I've learned so much, and so often in the past year, I've heard people who I perceive as good liberals say, well, why are people pushing so hard on bathroom issues? And it was really interesting to think about that. I mean, most of us, many of us middle-aged women, understand what it means to not have access to a bathroom right away, and it is, in fact, a terrible disadvantage. I wish that restaurants would have, all unisex bathrooms, because it drives me crazy to be in a line and then the men's room is open. I, in fact, use the men's room once a year. But I would like to say to you that I teach in one of the clinics, and people, I would say people who are poor tend to have clumping problems. People who are minorities tend to have clumping problems. When people have problems, they always clump. And you can't solve everybody's problems right away. And it is, in fact, staggered. So I think you have to do what you can when you have an opportunity to do it. And so yes, there are all these other issues, but I would encourage those of you who are working, and on these issues, to do the best you can on the issues that you can do, and then just keep going forward when the other issues are presented to you.
So let me give Jody a chance to respond. Let me say one last thing, and then we'll probably, out of respect for your time, I want to give Jody the last word. But one announcement I should have made earlier, if you want to try to do something, Indiana Legal Services is seeking 1 or 2 legal externs for a newly created low-income LGBT civil law project. Primary duties will include representing clients in legal name and gender change court proceedings. This is a 2-credit-hour externship. Is Kate Wood here from Indiana Legal Services? So talk to Kate or talk to Inga Venderkreuz, the law school's director of externships, if you're potentially interested in this opportunity. Okay. All right, Jody.
Okay, well, just I guess the last point that I wanted to make is that I think what you're speaking about really calls for an intersectional approach to the work that everyone's doing and looking for coalitions across, interest groups and advocacy organizations. If you check out the U.S. Trans Survey report, it's a constant theme that there are interdisciplinary discrimination is happening across all those groups. So respondents who were people of color across the board have higher rates of experiencing discrimination or experiencing poverty or unemployment. And pretty much every measure that's covered. The group as a whole was at twice the U.S. poverty rate, and that health indicators were also rather startling. So I think that report also points people to an intersectional approach to doing advocacy, that all these issues are intertwined, and there's actually evidence to back up that approach. So I guess that was, okay. I don't know if we want that to be the last word, but...
I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you for coming out to this program. This has been great. Great turnout. Thank you, Jody.
Okay, thank you.
And Are you willing to hang around and talk if people
Sure,
want to?
of course.
Jody's happy to talk, informally, but there are cookies and coffee in the back, donated. Please use them. And if you want to talk to Jody, she'll be here for a bit, so thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
The science question, all that is, I think it's